In 2018, a $40 million sci-fi film slipped quietly past audiences. Too strange, too unsettling, too easy to dismiss. But today, watching Annihilation feels different. What once seemed abstract now looks disturbingly familiar. A world where nature mutates beyond control, identity begins to fracture, and something unknowable rewrites reality itself. It wasn't marketed as a warning, it wasn't understood as a prediction, but nearly a decade later, it feels less like fiction, and more like a glimpse of what was coming next. Annihilation wasn't designed to be loud or explosive. There were no traditional heroes, no clear villains, and no satisfying answers waiting at the end. For many viewers, Annihilation felt distant, almost deliberately so. It moved slowly, spoke in fragments, and left entire questions unresolved. And because of that, it slipped past the mainstream almost unnoticed. Audiences didn't reject it with outrage, they simply disconnected. It was labeled confusing, overly abstract, and gently pushed aside. At the time, that reaction made sense. The film didn't behave like science fiction was expected to behave. It didn't explain itself. But time has a way of reshaping how stories are understood. And nearly a decade later, the same film begins to feel different. Not clearer necessarily, but closer. The images linger longer. The ideas feel less distant. What once felt like metaphor begins to resemble something more literal, and the discomfort it creates no longer comes from confusion, but recognition. The story begins simply enough. A zone appears along a coastal region, expanding slowly, almost patiently. It is referred to as the shimmer. Not a storm, not an invasion, not something that announces itself with violence. It just exists, unnoticeably distorting everything inside it. Plants grow in unfamiliar patterns. Animals behave unpredictably. The environment itself seems to be rewriting its own rules. And yet, what makes it unsettling is not its aggression, but its indifference. It doesn't attack. It doesn't defend. It simply changes things. At first glance, this feels like standard science fiction imagery. An unknown phenomenon, a team sent to investigate, a boundary between the known and the unknown. But the film avoids the expected path. There is no clear mission objective beyond understanding, no guarantee of survival, and most importantly, no assumption that understanding is even possible. The characters step into the shimmer not as conquerors, but as observers, uncertain, unprepared, and already slightly detached from the world they left behind. And that's where the tone shifts, because the deeper they go, the less the environment behaves like something external, and the more it begins to feel internal. The mutations aren't random. They are patterned, almost reflective. A plant growing in the shape of a human body, an animal carrying traits that don't belong to it, a landscape that feels familiar but wrong in ways that are difficult to articulate. It's not destruction, it's transformation, and that distinction matters. In 2018, this concept felt abstract, even poetic. But today, it lands differently, because the idea of a system, natural or artificial, changing beyond human control is no longer theoretical. It's part of everyday conversation. Climate patterns shift in ways that are difficult to predict. Technology evolves faster than regulation can keep up. Artificial systems begin to generate outcomes their creators don't fully understand. The fear is no longer that something will attack us. It's that something will change around us, and we won't be able to stop it. The shimmer operates on that exact principle. It doesn't need intention. It doesn't need purpose. It simply refracts. Everything that enters it, DNA, memory, identity, is broken down and reassembled into something new. Not better, not worse, just different. And the process is irreversible. Once you're inside, you're already part of it. What makes this particularly unsettling is how gently it unfolds. There are no dramatic warnings, no global panic. The outside world continues as normal, largely unaware of what's happening inside the boundary. Man, that contrast feels increasingly familiar. Because in reality, some of the most significant changes don't arrive with spectacle. They happen gradually, subtly. Until one day, the difference is undeniable, but the moment of transition is impossible to pinpoint. As the characters move deeper into the shimmer, their sense of self begins to erode, not in a dramatic, immediate way, but slowly. Memories become unreliable. Emotions shift without clear cause. There's a growing sense that something is happening beneath the surface, something they can't see but can feel. And that's where the film becomes less about the environment and more about identity. Because the real question isn't what the shimmer is doing to the world, it's what it's doing to the people inside it. There's a quiet moment in the film where one of the characters examines her own body, searching for signs of change. There's no injury, no visible shift, but the uncertainty is enough. The idea that something might be happening without her awareness is more unsettling than any visible threat. And that idea has become increasingly relevant. In a world where systems operate invisibly, algorithms shaping behavior, environments influencing biology, data redefining identity, the line between external influence and internal change becomes harder to define. The film doesn't offer answers. It doesn't explain the mechanics of the shimmer in a way that feels complete. And that was one of the reasons it struggled with audiences. People expect science fiction to provide clarity, to eventually reveal the logic behind the mystery. But here, the lack of explanation is intentional, because the unknown is not a puzzle to be solved. It's a condition to be experienced. And that's what makes it linger. There's a growing realization, both within the film and outside of it, that not everything can be controlled, not everything can be understood, and not everything will return to its original state. The characters enter the shimmer hoping to observe it, but by the time they realize they are being changed by it, the distinction between observer and subject has already disappeared. And that idea of crossing a boundary without realizing it feels particularly relevant now. Because in many ways, that boundary already exists. It's not marked by a visible wall or a glowing perimeter. It doesn't announce itself. But it's there, in the systems we interact with, in the environments we adapt to, in the technologies we rely on. The shift is gradual, almost imperceptible, but once it begins, it doesn't stop. And like the shimmer, it doesn't need to. By the time you notice the change, it's already part of you. There's a point in Annihilation where the idea of survival gradually disappears. Not because the characters give up, but because the definition of survival itself begins to shift. At the start, survival means returning home, escaping the shimmer, restoring normalcy. But as the change deepens, that goal becomes less clear. What does it mean to survive if the version of you that returns is no longer the same? What does it mean to escape if the change follows you out? The film never answers those questions directly. Instead, it allows them to exist, unresolved, uncomfortable, and increasingly relevant. Because one of the most unsettling aspects of the shimmer is that it doesn't destroy identity. It alters it, it refracts it. It takes what already exists and rearranges it into something unfamiliar. And that process is not violent. It's quiet, almost natural, like a system following its own logic, regardless of human understanding. In 2018, this felt like a conceptual idea, a metaphor for grief, for change, for the instability of the human mind. But in the years since, the metaphor has begun to feel less symbolic and more literal. Because the idea of identity being shaped and reshaped by external forces is no longer speculative. It's observable. Digital environments influence behavior. Algorithms prioritize certain thoughts over others. Information is filtered, repeated, amplified. And over time, those patterns begin to shape perception itself, not in a way that feels forced, but in a way that feels natural, invisible, gradual, just like the shimmer. And that's what makes the comparison unsettling. Because in both cases, the change is not imposed. It's absorbed, There's no single moment where everything shifts, no clear before and after. Instead, there's a slow accumulation of differences, small changes that over time become significant. And by the time those changes are recognized, they've already taken root. The characters in the film experience this in different ways. Some resist it, some deny it, some don't even realize it's happening, but none of them escape it. Because the shimmer doesn't require awareness, it doesn't need permission, it simply continues. And that idea of a process that operates independently of human control feels increasingly familiar. There's a tendency to believe that control is always possible, that with enough knowledge, enough preparation, enough technology, any system can be understood and managed. But the film challenges that assumption. It presents a phenomenon that exists beyond intention, beyond design, something that doesn't respond to human logic because it isn't bound by it. And in doing so, it introduces a different kind of fear, not fear of destruction, but fear of adaptation without consent. Because destruction is final, it has an endpoint. Reconfiguration does not. It continues, it evolves, and it leaves behind something that is neither fully familiar nor entirely foreign. The final sequences of the film lean into this ambiguity. They don't provide closure in the traditional sense. There's no clear resolution, no definitive explanation of what the shimmer was or why it appeared. Instead, there's a lingering uncertainty, a sense that whatever happened inside the boundary hasn't truly ended, that it may still be continuing, just in a different form. And that's where the film's relevance becomes most apparent. Because the idea that a system could evolve beyond its original boundaries, imperceptibly, gradually, without clear detection, is no longer confined to fiction. It's a concept that appears in discussions about technology, biology, and the environment. Systems that begin in one place, under controlled conditions, and then expand, adapt, and integrate into the broader world. Not with intention, not with awareness, but with inevitability. And that's the word that lingers. The shimmer doesn't feel urgent. It doesn't rush. It doesn't need to. Its power comes from its persistence, from its ability to continue regardless of resistance, and that persistence is what makes it effective. Because it doesn't rely on a single moment of impact, it relies on time. And time is something every system has. By the end of the film, the question is no longer whether the characters have changed. That much is clear. The question is whether that change can be contained, whether it can be isolated, understood, or reversed. And the answer, implied but never stated, is uncertain, because once a system begins to alter the structure of reality itself, whether that reality is physical, biological, or psychological, the idea of returning to a previous state becomes increasingly unlikely. And that's where the film stops feeling like a story, because the possibility it presents doesn't end with the characters. It extends outward, into the world beyond the screen, into the systems that shape everyday life, into the environments that evolve without direct oversight. It suggests that change doesn't always arrive as a disruption. Sometimes it arrives as a process, quiet, consistent, and difficult to detect. And by the time it's fully understood, it's already complete. That's what makes Annihilation different from other science fiction films of its time. It doesn't rely on spectacle or urgency. It doesn't build toward a single moment of resolution. Instead, it presents an idea and allows it to unfold slowly, both within the narrative and within the viewer's mind. An idea that doesn't demand attention, but rewards it. Because the real impact of the film isn't immediate. It's delayed. It lingers. It resurfaces later when the world begins to resemble the concepts it once presented as fiction. And that's when the perspective shifts. What was once dismissed as confusing becomes unsettlingly clear. What was once abstract begins to feel specific, and what was once considered a failure starts to look like something else entirely. Not a prediction in the traditional sense, not a direct forecast of events, but a reflection of patterns, of possibilities, of directions that at the time seemed distant, but no longer do, and maybe that's the most unsettling part. Not that the film predicted anything exactly, but that it understood something early, something that years later is only now becoming visible, not all at once, but slowly and without stopping. The final sequences lean into ambiguity. No clear resolution, no definitive explanation of the shimmer. Whatever happened inside hasn't truly ended. It may continue, in a different form. This reflects reality. Systems evolve beyond their boundaries gradually, without detection, not with intention, not with awareness, but inevitably. The shimmer's power comes from persistence. Time is its tool, and time is something every system has. By the end, the question isn't whether characters have changed, it's whether that change can be contained, understood, or reversed. The answer, implied but never stated, is uncertain. Once a system alters reality, physical, biological, psychological, returning to a previous state becomes unlikely. The film stops feeling like a story. Its possibilities extend beyond the characters, into the world, beyond the screen, into environments evolving without direct oversight. Change doesn't always arrive as disruption. Sometimes it arrives as a process, quiet, consistent, difficult to detect. By the time it's understood, it's complete. Annihilation doesn't rely on spectacle or urgency. It presents an idea, letting it unfold slowly in the narrative and in the viewer's mind. What was dismissed as confusing becomes unsettlingly clear. Abstract ideas feel specific. What once seemed like a failure looks different entirely. Not a prediction exactly, but an early understanding of patterns, directions, and possibilities now visible. Slowly, unstoppable. Annihilation isn't just a sci-fi story, it's a meditation on change. The shimmer reshapes everything it touches, leaving what enters altered, never the same. Its effects unfold gently, beyond control or awareness, when echoing the systems around us. The film lingers, reminding us that some shifts aren't sudden. They integrate, persist, and quietly redefine everything.